Good morning to those of you in the United States, Canada, and the rest of the Americas. Good afternoon to those of you in the UK, Europe, and Israel. My name is Dan Cederbaum, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the Mordechai M. Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood. It is my pleasure to welcome you to Religious Naturalists Really Believe in God, exploring some fundamental issues at the intersection of theology and philosophy. You are in for 2 days of fascinating conversations. I have posted in the chat some important links, and the chat is open. My email address, where you can ask me questions and pose questions to the presenters. I'll say another word about that before we formally begin with the speakers. I've also put up links to the speaker bios, as well as to our full conference webpage, which includes the panels by time slot. We will not be doing biographies of the speakers orally, just in the interest of saving time for them. So for anybody who doesn't know, the Kaplan Center was organized at the end of 2010 and is based in Evanston, Illinois. It is a not-for-profit organization devoted to the transformation of Jewish community through the dissemination and promotion of the thought and writings of Mordechai Kaplan, and the advancement of the agenda of the Kaplanian approach to Judaism in the 21st century. The Kaplan Center's perspective is explicitly trans-denominational and trans-stream. I want to acknowledge, though not by name at this point, I have a number of my professional and volunteer colleagues from the Kaplan Center in the meeting. You'll be hearing from one of them this afternoon, Mel Skult. I also want to thank our two co-sponsors, Bet Am Shalom Synagogue and Temple Israel Center, the White Plains synagogues that were looking forward to hosting us physically, and we wish that could have happened, but we're still delighted to have you all with us virtually. I know we did something right with the title, Do Religious Naturalists Really Believe in God? Because some people think that it suggests that the answer is obviously no, and others think that it suggests that the answer is obviously yes. I also will note that the conference announcement was accidentally posted on the H Buddhist listserv before the H Judaic listserv, which may have been appropriate. We are delighted we have such a large turnout. We have a number of experts in the so-called audience who could just as well have been presenters. And as may be obvious, while we have more than 300 people registered, we expect people to come and go, just be quiet when leaving the room. Sorry, a little Zoom joke. Each speaker this morning has promised to take no more than 20 minutes or so as to allow substantial time for audience interaction. Questions this morning will be taken after the completion of all three talks, although I may insert clarifying questions earlier. So send me your questions as they occur to you. And you can do that in either of two ways, please. One is email, and as I said, it's dan@kaplancenter.org, and that's posted in the chat, or in the chat itself. I'm going to ask, I know it gets a little complicated, that you please chat to me privately your questions rather than posting them generally. Having said that, you are welcome to post general comments and rhetorical or other sort of non-specific questions in the group chat to everyone as well. We are honored to dedicate this conference to the memories of two of the Kaplan Center's esteemed senior fellows, Rabbi Dr. Neil Gilman, who lived from 1933 to 2017, and Rabbi Dr. Peter Noble, who lived from 1943 to 2019, Zichronam Livracha. Each of these important leaders was a significant religious thinker, as you know, in his own right. I want to acknowledge that both Abigail Gilman and Deborah Gilman, Rabbi Dr. Gilman's daughters, either have joined us, I can't see everybody's name, or will be joining us, which is a particularly wonderful way for us to acknowledge their memories. We also have among our presenters people who knew each of them well. And while I don't have time, I wish I did at the moment, to go more into all of their wonderful accomplishments, I do invite those presenters who knew them personally to share their thoughts briefly when they speak during the conference. Delighted that we are also streaming this program through the relatively new Jewish Live portal. And so thanks to our friends Dan Liebenson and Lex Rofberg of Judaism Unbound fame for that and for all of their good work. Recordings of this and almost all of our other programs are or will soon be available on the Kaplan Center website. So we turn to our first speaker, Dr. Ari Ackerman, whose topic is Kaplan and Heschel on religious experience.
Okay, firstly, it's a great honor to initiate this important conference, and I want to thank Rabbi Dan Cederbaum for organizing it. This is obviously a very important topic in philosophy of religion and in Jewish philosophy, and it just takes on added significance in these theologically and spiritually challenging times. Now, I want to examine this issue from the perspective of two of the most important Jewish philosophers of the 20th century, Mordechai Kaplan and Abraham Joshua Heschel. And I just want to clarify just my topic. I will be dealing less with religious experience and dealing more with religious naturalism. And I will argue that one of the most significant conversations on the question of religious naturalism in modern Jewish thought takes place between these two thinkers. They stake out diametrically opposed positions, and what's additionally important is they frame their position in response to the other's philosophy. Their opposing conceptions of God is part of a broader debate regarding what are the ails of modern Jewish existence and what's the requisite prescription to revert Judaism to its true nature. For Kaplan, and this will come up quite often, Judaism is always and should continue to be a national civilization that meets the individual needs of its members. And by contrast, Heschel's understanding of Judaism is theocentric and opposes Jewish philosophies which are overly concerned with individual self-fulfillment and Jewish nationalism. Now, on the surface, it seems that these opposing understandings of Judaism were developed in isolation from one another. Surprisingly, Kaplan and Heschel almost make no mention of one another in their numerous philosophic works and outwardly display little interest in disputing one another. Now, it's true from the early 40s till the 60s, 70s, both are the two dominant American Jewish thinkers. Since early 1940, when Heschel arrives at JTS, there develops a personal relationship between the two of them. So they were clearly aware of each other's positions, but they seem to ignore one another and display little interest in the philosophy of the other. But I want to argue that, on the contrary, the philosophies of Kaplan and Heschel in general, and particularly the question of their conception of God and their attitudes towards religious naturalism, are deeply intertwined. Each thinker viewed their philosophy as the mirror image of their colleague, and each was deeply disturbed by the inroads that their theological rival was making among American Jews. And as a result, they were occupied, and one could even argue preoccupied, with rebutting one another. And although there's no explicit references of Kaplan and Heschel's works, and vice versa, almost, their writings are replete with veiled polemics at each other. For example, Kaplan often decries the ascendancy of religious existential among Jews, and he's clearly referring to Heschel here. I'll give you one reference here from Judaism Without Supernaturalism. He writes there, the Apostle Paul started this cult, and he's referring here to religious existentialism, and he's calling it a cult. And he goes on, which may be called the religion of unreason. Barth, Brunner, and Niebuhr have made it fashionable, and some Jewish theologians are dancing its tunes. Now here he speaks of Jewish theologians following the great Christian thinker Niebuhr, who not coincidentally was Heschel's close friend and theological partner. So here we can understand, and I think Heschel intended us to understand, that this sentence as a clear criticism of Heschel. And likewise, Heschel's writings are absent generally from Kaplan's works, but Heschel's writings almost, not almost, I think they have no explicit reference, to the best of my knowledge, to Kaplan, but they're veiled references to his theological opponent. And I'll just bring one of them from a paper in a JTS-sponsored conference in 1952. The conference was on religious symbolism. Kaplan also gave a paper in the same conference, and both Kaplan and Heschel's papers were published in the conference proceedings. And now in this lecture, Kaplan's in the audience, and Heschel rails against those who view halakha as comprised of folkways. He uses the word folkways. He also speaks critically of those who claimed that prayer is the identification of worship with the people of Israel. And he critiques people who see God as symbol of social action. Now, these are all central ideas in Kaplan. And then he goes on in perhaps the most obvious allusion to Kaplan. He states, and I'm quoting, "There are some people who believe that the only way to revitalize the synagogue is to minimize the importance of prayer and convert the synagogue into a center." So without ever mentioning his name, Heschel frames the ills of American Jewry as largely due to the over-reliance on Kaplan's pragmatic, anthropocentric, sociological approach to Judaism. And Heschel offers his own philosophy as anti-pragmatic, theocentric, and individualistic. So a close readings of the writings of Heschel and Kaplan, I believe, will allow us to surface an extensive and implicit dialogue between these two thinkers. And we're just going to look at a small segment of this debate, which applies to the question of the validity and efficacy of religious naturalism. Now let's begin with the religious naturalism of Kaplan. Now it's evident from the quote that I just cited from Judaism Without Supernaturalism that Kaplan argues that Jewish theology tends towards a Jewish traditional theology, and he would lump Heschel into this group. It tends towards a conception of God that does not accord with reason or science. And he calls this religion of unreason, and he views it simply as outdated and unacceptable for a theological grounding of modern Jewish existence. For Kaplan, the traditional personalistic conception of God, who communicates with human beings, seeks them out, and cares for them, must be replaced. He also eschews a conception of an absolute, omnipotent, and omniscient God who stands outside of the world, creates it, and determines what happens therein. And I'll just bring a short quote from Judaism as a Civilization. God is not an identifiable being who stands outside the universe. He therefore rejects the historicity of the biblical account of divine miracles and radically reinterprets the notion of creation and revelation. But paradoxically, Kaplan, in calling for a radical reconstruction of the conception of God in naturalistic and non-traditional terms, believes that he is bringing to the surface something that is latent within the tradition. So how can this be? How can he conceive of his conception of God as radically anti-traditional, as well as deeply connected to the tradition? And I think the answer is that for Kaplan, the Torah, like any religious and cultural document, is an attempt to meet innate human needs. It is functional and pragmatic and not interested in offering an abstract and theoretical theology. Instead, its reflection on God and the practices it mandates addresses deeply seated and permanent strivings of human beings. And this can be retained. You have to strip the religious symbolism of its literal meaning, but using sociology and psychology of religion, you have to get at the function played by religious beliefs and rituals. And that's certainly the approach to the faith in God. His primary concern is identifying the pragmatic cash value of the belief in God in the Jewish tradition, retaining it, but restructuring it in a way that its historic positive function is retained while discarding the supernatural exterior. So that's I would say, his hermeneutic strategy. So this leads us to Kaplan's understanding of the reality of God and the function of the belief in God. And he basically argues that the functional meaning of the traditional belief in God as creator is that God is the creative life force of the universe. And in this regard, God is not a being or an entity, but a cosmic potency or process. This leads him to distinguish between science's conception of nature and religious conception of God, even though he thinks they're compatible and actually complementary, but he thinks science is interested in the mechanistic side of nature, and religious thinking captures the intentional and theological dimensions of the universe, that which provides cosmic support for human values and strivings. And that's what he means by perhaps the most well-known line in all of his writings: God is the power that makes for salvation. God is the process within nature and within us as part of the natural order, which pushes us towards and supports the actualization of our ideals and ethical striving. So the function of the belief in God is to allow us the possibility to better ourselves in the world and to act upon this belief. In essence, the belief in God is a positive, amelioristic orientation to the world. The world isn't complete, but we can make it complete. And the supernaturalistic assumptions that usually accompany a belief in God, those are irrelevant and for Kaplan, for the true function of belief in God. Now, in just summing up my treatment of Kaplan, I would argue that it's important to get at the anthropocentric character. In the Jewish tradition, for Kaplan, there is a requirement to accept divine authority, and the Kabbalat Ol Malchut entails at times subordinating of human desires and needs to the divine will. But Kaplan argues that this theocentric character of religion must be abandoned because it blocks human beings from getting at self-realization and self-actualization. So religion in general and Judaism in particular must be reconstructed they must take on an anthropocentric orientation by serving the aesthetic, social, economic, spiritual, and moral needs of individual Jews. More specifically, the God idea must be reframed, and it must be shifted from the acceptance of authority of an external being to an recognition of the human being as the agents of change. In other words, for Kaplan, it's not just that the traditional belief in God is irrational, it's also problematic because it's overly authoritarian and theocentric. Okay? So now let's turn our attention to the philosophy of Heschel. And I want to briefly inspect his attitude towards natural religion and theology, and specifically to Kaplan's version of natural religion. Now, generally, it is clear that Heschel is deeply critical of pragmatism and the naturalism of Kaplan's theology. However, he does accept a limited conception of natural religion. When we're dealing with Kaplan, and we're talking about natural religion, we're talking about a natural religion where the conception of God is deeply equated with nature. God is largely certain natural processes that are happening in the world. But there's a different definition of natural religion. I'll here quote the Webster definition of natural religion. Natural religion is a religion validated on the basis of human reason and experience apart from miraculous or supernatural revelation. So if we understand natural religion as grounded in the possibility that we can get at God through natural facilities of a human being, then Heschel does actually accept a qualified sense of this type of natural religion. He doesn't require the aid of divine revelation to initially get at and experiencing the divine. He accepts that human beings are equipped to recognize God through human feelings and intuitions. The feeling that leads us to God for Heschel is a natural sense of wonder, what he calls radical amazement. Heschel believes that generally human beings, particularly moderns, approach the world callously through a utilitarian lens, but naturally human beings are able to sense a deeper level of reality, which is wondrous and incommunicable. So if we strip away our pragmatic perspective and our sense of routinization, then our examination of nature and history will lead to an awareness that everything points to the sublime and the absolute. And for Heschel, this foundational religious insight is the first and necessary step towards a religious consciousness. But usually, when we talk about religious naturalism as human beings able to get at God apart from divine revelation, unassisted by divine revelation, the human faculty that we're usually talking about is reason. And here, Heschel starts departing from Kaplan and religious naturalism in general. For him, for Heschel, it's certainly not reason that gets us to God initially. And according to Heschel, divine reality engenders surprise and wonder due to the mystery that characterizes it, and therefore it's ineffable and cannot be captured by categories of reason and tools of language. And our awareness of God initially is pre-linguistic and pre-discursive. But there's an even more fundamental way in which Heschel distances himself from Kaplan, and he argues that actually divine revelation, or let me put it this way, for Heschel, the human faculty, this religious insight, only gets us so far in terms of God. And we have to ask, what is it that divine revelation supplies for Heschel regarding God that the powerful religious intuition of human beings failed to get at? Why is wonder and radical amazement, which produces awe and reverence, not sufficient? Now, one answer for Heschel is that it saves us from the theological error that in his mind Kaplan had made. Kaplan follows Spinoza and views God as some cosmic impersonal force. And this theological error, in Heschel's opinion, isn't confined to Spinoza and Kaplan, but it's the original sin of Jewish philosophy since the time of Philo. It represents the Hellenization of Jewish theology, which posited the God of the philosophers instead of the God of the prophets. Even Maimonides is accused by Heschel as employing an improper theological method and arriving at a mistaken conception of God. And principally, what Revelation teaches us then is that God is in search of human beings and even in need of them. And Maimonides' Aristotelian God, who is wholly other, lacks the transitivity of the Jewish God who seeks out human beings and cares for them. Maimonides erroneously views perfection as rooted in self-sufficiency and immutability, and he doesn't realize that God's responsiveness to the plight of human beings, divine pathos and passion, is a sign of true divinity, and passionlessness is actually a sign of weakness. Okay, so the God who we get at through conceptual proofs, for Heschel, they're abstractions. They're not the living and loving God. And it is only the personal and emotive God that is worthy of being an object of awe, reverence, prayer, and the partner in a covenantal relationship. So I've really tried to describe these very antithetical nature of the theologies and philosophies of Judaism offered by Kaplan and Heschel. And I see my time is pretty much up. I see Dan nodding. So I just wanted to say in conclusion that there are actually many points of contact between Kaplan and Heschel. Both are diasporic Zionists, both talk about religious experience, even piety. They have a shared commitment to social activism. And I see Mel writing to me. I actually wanted to point out, Mel and I have had many conversations about the relationship between Heschel and Kaplan. And there's really a different way of looking at Heschel, the relationship, seeing them much more in common. There's a way of trying to bridge the gap. I've kind of I've tried to frame them as irreconcilable, but there is a way. I raised the question, if there is a way to bridge the gap between Heschel and Kaplan. Mel has a very important article on their relationship, and he sees a lot more commonality than I do. And as a segue to our next speaker, to Art Green, Art actually synthesized, I think you can read his theology as a synthesis between Heschel and Kaplan. Art is a student of Heschel. He also formulates a certain neo-Hasidic theology, but to a certain degree, he also adds certain Kaplanian elements, particularly in his conception of God and his attitude in halakha, and you have really an interesting mix between Heschel and Kaplan. And with that, I will turn over the virtual microphone to Art, and thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to hearing questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Yashkar, thank you, Ari. Meet me for a second first. Dan, I've been asked to correct one thing you said, which is I'm not a rabbi.
Oh,
I
okay.
get this back all the time. Just want to be honest here.
Okay.
That was great, and I love speakers who time themselves. So,
Oh, okay.
so it's now as Ari he did the perfect segue, and so it's my pleasure to introduce, not that he needs any introduction, I'm sure, to this group, Rabbi Dr. Arthur Green.
Thank you, Dan. I was about to take your smicha back before you rescinded it yourself. So I'm glad to know you're honest about it. Indeed, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank you for organizing this conference. And Ari, it's wonderful to come after you because in many ways your talk is precisely an introduction to what I have to say. Unlike my usual habit, I wrote a formal paper for this occasion. I'm going to read that paper with you. I think some of you have the facility, if you want to have the text in front of you rather than looking at me during the course of that. But that's
I will. I'm sorry. I asked Art if you wanted to cue me later, or you want me to just share it now. I'm happy.
You can share it now. Yes. Because I do theology in a highly personal way, something I affirmed early in choosing Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw rather than Netanya as my Hasidic mentor, I open by quoting. I'm sorry. You just. Okay. Good. We just covered my text. I need to recover my text now. Thank you. I open by quoting several documents from my past. The first is a letter by my grandma Green, my father's immigrant atheist mother, dated March 1st, 1961. I presented to you in her original night school English, of which she was very proud. I see in your letter that you are planning to become a rabbi. Well, good luck to you. But I would be more proud of you if you would be a good teacher and teach people to be smart and believe in things that are real, rather than teach them things that are unbelievable. If there would be a God in heaven, he would be shot down by all the missiles and Sputniks. I've always felt that I owed it to her not to believe in a God that could quite literally be shot out of the sky. Next comes a query by Commentary Magazine in a survey conducted in 1996, titled, "What do American Jews believe?" This, of course, was the neoconservative commentary's meme of the famous commentary symposium of 30 years earlier, 1966, The Condition of Jewish Belief. I was invited to participate. The opening question was, do you believe in God? My answer began with the word phooey, followed with, that was the wrong question. How about, do you use the word God in your vocabulary, and what do you mean by it? I suspected the next question was going to be, are you or have you ever been a member of ... Somewhat more gently, I today want to repeat my objection to that formulation. My final dip into past documents is from an essay, How I Pray, originally written as a supplement to my Hebrew edition of Radical Judaism, came out 3 years ago, but now appearing in English for the first time in my just published collection of essays, Judaism for the World, coming out next month. But here we are very much in the world where I hang my hat today. Rabbi Shalom, Lord of the universe, I do not believe in you. You are all good maker and master, you who watch and listen. Do you taste, sniff, and touch us as well? I know everything and act for goodness always. You who support the fallen, heal the sick, release the bound, and keep faith with those who lie in the dust. I do not believe in you. I have seen and tasted too much dust. I read the daily headlines, war, destruction, plague, typhoon, tsunami, earthquake. I have dared to love and watched my loved ones die. Those fool enough to love me will soon watch me die as well. Why? What should I believe? Kohelet said it all. In a world filled with both human evil and nature's indifference to us, how am I supposed to believe in you? But to whom can I bring the pain of my disbelief if not to you? To whom can I cry out if not to you, the all, the foundation on whom my house is built, rock upon whom I stand, seed to whose oblivion I will fall when oblivion becomes my fate? Am I too weak to live without you, without a someone into whose ear to scream, so that I have to invent you, O terrible plaything of my imagination? There are days when it feels like that. Or am I indeed, as I think on better days, wise enough to have seen beyond the horizons of my daily mind, deep enough to see the truth of truths, the far shores on the chasm of great emptiness so well described by Rabbi Nachman, to recover a truth beyond ordinary reality, beyond words? That truth knows of something I can barely address as you, but surely cannot call an it. Then I dare to open myself and turn to you, the hope and dream of that place, across the chasm that is none other than the hole in my broken heart, that gives me life, that allows me to go forward day after day. I do not believe in you, but my life is saved because I do not believe in believing either. Believing has about it the air of intellectual proposition, a claim that cannot be proven, and therefore is a matter of mere belief. But you are on the other end of that spectrum of doubt, belief, and certainty. You are above the line rather than below, or vice versa. I do not believe in you. I know you. A knowing that always bears within it that first occasion of the biblical word for knowing, Adam knew his wife Eve. I know you with an intimacy even beyond that sexual knowing. I know you as I know myself, since this little individual human self is so very obviously a part and reflection of universal self, of the one that underlies and overlays and precedes and follows and surrounds and fills and laughs and cries within all that is, was, will be. That is more than a belief, it is a knowing, a message from the root of my contemplative soul, one that I have sought long and hard to escape so many times, but to which I always return. Being a senior figure among Jewish seekers these days, I attract contact from all sorts of younger folks, including readers of mine. I'm especially delighted at my many readers in Israel and Hebrew translation, but also people who've just heard my name and think I represent something different. One of the most interesting such occasions to me recently was a young man who was an undergraduate at Yeshiva University. He mentioned me to one of his teachers there, asking whether he should read me, and was told, "Green is nothing but Kaplan with a strimal." I rather enjoyed that, as I think some of you will. I miss the laughter from the audience, what can I tell you? Just the thought of it. I imagine that characterization goes back to Rabbi Daniel Landis' somewhat vicious review of my radical Judaism, and our correspondence about that, which can be found on JewSchool.com. There, Landis said, quote, "Green's God is not the God of Israel, and his Torah is not the Torah of Israel," and proclaimed Mordechai Kaplan to be my hidden master, a big surprise to many old-time Reconstructionists, to be sure. My guess is that it is more likely his teacher read Landis than Green. But I want to say that humor set aside, it is not a true or accurate characterization. For those who don't know, I was a student of Abraham, now you know, you heard from Ari, I was a student of Abraham Joshua Heschel, not Mordechai Kaplan. Kaplan, by the way, retired from teaching the year I entered JTS. Despite the significant degree to which I moved beyond Heschel, that very much remains the case. For Kaplan, as I understand him, religion is at its core a social phenomenon, a society's way of articulating and keeping faith with its highest values. Despite our friend Mel Scout's efforts to present the seeker and poet in Kaplan, I think this socio-civilizational approach, with Jewish peoplehood as the center of the circle, is bedrock Kaplan. Bedrock Heschel, for me, are the first 100 pages of God in Search of Man, describing religion as being about the inner life, depth theology, as he calls it. Religion, in this case Judaism, exists in order to offer a set of tools for the cultivation of that inwardness, rather than serving primarily as a social phenomenon or a projection of communal values. The essential way stations in Heschel's inward journey and mine are wonder and mystery, awe and love. The Jewish people is an entity that shares this ancient legacy of spiritual language, one that both Hasidism, Heschel's entry place into Judaism, and mine, Neo-Hasidism, seek to revive. I share with Heschel a concern about the secularization of consciousness in our modern and postmodern world, a loss of a sense of mysterious profundity of life, the loss of values like reverence and humility that are inspired by an openness to that profundity. I rejoice in the fact that the questions Heschel raises are universal, reaching far beyond Judaism into an examination of what it means to be a religious human being in the broadest sense. I share his assertion that our response to the perception of divine presence in the world has to be an activist one, working to create a human society in which the divine image is respected in every human being, where Malchut Shaddai will be realized in a way that means Shaddai lechol breotav, the more equal sharing of wealth, resources, and respect with those deprived of them. Seeing inwardness in the individual's quest as the core of religion does not lean toward a turning aside from social responsibility and religion's great power to transform the world for good. Toward this goal, alliance with other such progressive religious forces in the world is a necessity, and Heschel took a lead in that as well. Although I, like Heschel, ground my theology in the testimony of inner experience, I diverged from him precisely on our question for today, reformulated as, What do you mean when you say Yud He Vav He? I turn to the Hebrew rather than the English term because I have no particular investment in defending the use of the word God, deriving as it does from the Anglo-Saxon version of ancient Germanic tongues, stemming from the language of European paganism. But the Shem Havaya does have ultimate meaning for me. My theology may rightly be described as a mystical and monistic panentheism. While committed to many elements of traditional religious language, I am ultimately a monist. I seek to understand the Jewish faith in one God as pointing beyond itself toward the ultimate oneness of existence. I believe that there is only one. Better said, I have glimpses of an inner experience that tells me there is only one. That one embraces, surrounds, and fills all the infinitely varied forms that existence has taken and ever will take. We Jews call out that truth twice daily in reciting Shema Yisrael. Havaya is one means there is none other. Our daily experience of variety, separate identity, and alienation of self from other renders an incomplete and ultimately misleading picture of reality. Atahu Achnivraha Olam Vatahu Mishnivraha Olam. You are the one before the world was created and since the world was created. Unchanged, eternal. Worldly existence covers over the reality of that deeper truth, but human consciousness is so constructed so as to permit glimpses of it to shine through. I do not claim any uniqueness or special status in having perceived moments of that reality. I believe that many people have such insights. Most, including me at times, work hard to deny or flee them. The one being is clothed within each being. For reasons we do not begin to understand, that one dressed itself in this coat of many colors called the universe, and on this planet entered into the endless dance of variety and multiplicity that we call evolution. It did so and continues to do so, not with any sense of intentionality that we can understand from human will or intellect. Yet it does seem to move, albeit unsteadily, over the eons toward both complexity and diversity in the forms through which it is manifest. It is present within each unique form of existence that has come to be in the universe and yet remains one, in and through them all. The Zohar refers to this as Yichuda Ila'a, the upper unity, meaning there is only one, and Yichuda Tata'a, the lower unity, meaning the perseverance of that unity even amid the endless diversity of existence. This glimpse of a monist or panentheist worldview, one that sees God in all, the one manifest in each of the many, but the mystery ever beyond our grasp, lies deeply veiled within Judaism, and so too in Christianity and Islam, behind the mask of religious personalism, faith in a personified deity who created this world as a human-like act of will, rules over history, guides each person's faith, and promises redemption. But awareness of this all-pervasive spiritual presence that fills the world is never completely absent from these Western faith traditions, partly due to their shared Neoplatonic legacy. Yes, Ari, that which Hesser was criticizing, very much so. Behold, he stands behind our wall, peering through the windows, gazing through the cracks. The one is ever peering through the masks of personalism and multiplicity, behind which it is hidden. An invitation for us to peer behind those masks as well. The ancient rabbis referred to God as the place of the world, meaning there is no place devoid of God's presence, that the world exists within the one. Yud He Vav He came to refer to an abstract and elusive entity that preceded and underlay all existence. This is not to admit, as Kaplan would have had it, that mystics are fuzzy thinkers, but rather that there is an essential fuzz that reaches beyond our ability to think. That fuzz is referred to in the biblical narrative, as read through the Hasidic lens, as Av Ha'anan, the thick cloud, which Moses, the seeker, has to enter, Ki Sham Ha'Elohim, that is where God is. Transcendence in the context of such a faith does not refer to a God out there or over there, somewhere beyond the universe. Since I do not know the existence of such a there, I don't want that God to get shot down again. Transcendence rather means that Yud He Vav He, or being, is, was, will be, is so fully present in the here and now of each moment that we could not possibly grasp the profundity of that presence. Transcendence thus dwells within immanence. Transcendence is first and foremost an epistemological truth, as it is mostly for Maimonides. I make no ontological claim for it. There is no ultimate duality here, no God and world, no God, world, and self, but only one being and its many faces, including our own. The quest to know that one lies at the heart of my philosophical and spiritual path. I was attracted to such a reading of Judaism primarily through the writings of two great Jewish thinkers, one Hasidic and one Neo-Hasidic. When I was 20 years old, I read an essay by Hillel Zeitlin, who was essentially channeling the theology of Dov Ber of Mezrich. Zeitlin's opening chapters, the fundaments of Hasidism, those on being and nothingness, Tzimtzum, and the power of the maker within the made, are summarized in what I have said above. I finally translated that essay. It's in my volume of Zeitlin's writings in English. Interestingly, Dov Ber took his highly abstract theology and, in an attempt to make it accessible, described it in folksy parables, mostly about fathers and sons, kings and princes. To oversimplify somewhat, I might say that Heschel, a direct descendant of the Maggid, was more attracted by the mashal, the warm human language of the parable, and I more by the abstract nimshal, the truth toward which the parables pointed. Heschel needs there to be a divine voice that comes from beyond the mystery, a transcendent declaration of love, caring, and call to action. For him, the ultimate needs to be personal, and vice versa. For me, it is from within the Av Ha'anan, rather than from beyond it, that I feel myself called. To say it differently, I believe there is a deep monistic stream within the Jewish mystical thought, one that lies hidden behind the face of religious personalism that had been inherited from earlier eras. Ours is an age, I believe, when that understanding of Judaism needs to be taken out of the closet. I should also say here that my approach differs from Heschel and that I make no claim to speak for anyone but myself and the sources as I present them. Heschel, especially in facing the loss of the Shoah, felt a great need to stand as a representative voice of the entire tradition, often speaking in the language of biblical imperatives. This is what Judaism teaches was the platform on which he stood. That is why he refused to be labeled as mystic or chassid. He wanted to claim the whole tradition as his own. I offer only my own readings of carefully selected Jewish sources, especially mystical Hasidic teachings, in which I have been steeped for so many years, in the hope that others too might find my insights useful. The cover of my Radical Judaism defines me as neither theist nor atheist, but something else. I do not believe in a supreme being. I believe that being is supreme. I like to think of myself as belonging to the community of Dorshei Yichudecha, those who seek your unity, as 16th century Elazar Azikri, among others, described the Jews. Divine unity means the affirmation that all existence is one. All apparently multifarious reality is a levush, a term I use as do the mystical sources with great frequency, a garment. Havaya dwells within the human heart and within all existence as well. Every extant form is one of the infinite expressions of Havaya, one of the endless faces of being of the divine one. Here we must distinguish my theology of panentheism from pantheism, or the belief that God is the sum of all reality, divinity and the world, universe, or cosmos being identical. For the panentheist, or at least this one, seeing all beings through the lens of oneness is transformative, opening a gateway to infinity. Havaya embraces the totality of being and yet is infinitely more as well. The divine infuses the world and is expressed through the cosmos, but nothing, not even the name Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh, can adequately convey the infinity of the one. Reality as we encounter it is the self-expression of a singular force, one that has always been present within the universe, and in a way almost entirely opaque to our perception, beyond our ken of it as well. This infinity is not comprehensible or even credible to the rational human mind that thinks in terms marked by measure, definition, and limit. It is, however, perceptible to a different level of human consciousness, one that dwells deep below our ordinary consciousness and lives in subtle contact with it. It is to this level of human mind, you may call it the mythic or symbolic imagination, that religious language, including both verbal speech and that residing in symbolic gesture, is meant to appeal. Religious teaching, translating Torah, points us toward that level of discourse and opens us to it. You might say that my thinking is best understood as a Jewish parallel to the approaches to religion and mythology of a Wilfred Cantwell Smith or a Joseph Campbell. I understand religious myth as a universal human phenomenon, and one that speaks a deeper truth than can be spoken of in discursive prose. I am not quite a perennialist in my understanding of the phenomenon of religion, but I am influenced by their thinking, as well as by the allied teachings of Jungian psychology. Hillel Zeitlin once argued that Spinoza saw the world as a machine immutably governed by the laws of nature, but the Baal Shem Tov saw the same world as an ongoing work of art, with God as the artist creator, ever fashioning it anew. I stand within this tradition of my Hasidic and Neo-Hasidic forebears, but I live in the 21st century, meaning that I see that constant recreation as taking place within an evolutionary context. The task of theology is one of reframing the accepted accounts of nature and origins and natural history offered by the scientific consensus, helping us to view them in a different way, one that may guide us toward a more profound appreciation of that same reality, and indeed inspire us to help preserve it. The tale of life's origins and development, including its essential building blocks of natural selection, is well known to us as moderns. But what would it mean to recount that tale with our eyes truly open? And what will that attempt reveal of what we might call Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh? We would come to see the entire course of evolution, from the simplest life forms millions of years ago to the great complexity of the human brains, now still barely understood, and proceeding onward into the unknown future as a meaningful process. That is how I interpret the Torah's Vayomer Elohim, or the rabbis, God looked into the Torah and created the world. Torah means language, and language makes for the possibility of meaning. The process by which the world came to be is ultimately a decipherable and meaningful one. This is the poesis that underlies science. It can be translated from the realm of transcendent mystery into linguistic symbols, into the linguistic symbols we need in order to wrap our minds around it. That translation is as close as we can come to divine speech. Moses, shall we think of him as embodying the human quest for wisdom? At Sinai serves as the Maturgaman, the translator for Havaya, the one who dwells in a realm beyond language, who speaks only through thunderclaps, and perhaps all the other sounds of nature as well. The Torah of Moses, the seeker's teaching, is our guide in making meaning out of that cacophony. Kabbalists and scientists might agree that there will always be a part of it that eludes us. Remember that the Kabbalists taught there were lights behind the letters of Torah. Those lights are a way of referring to a greater abstraction, leading towards something still more elusive. Here, the Neoplatonic vision of spiritual enlightenment peers through the personalist mask. But there are not only lights, there are also sounds behind the letters in our Torah scroll. Since we're having this conversation in the days leading up to Rosh Hashanah, I want to say a word about the shofar. Amid those thunderclaps at Sinai was the sound of a shofar growing louder and louder. Was there someone blowing a shofar there? We're not told that. Or was it the thunderbolts themselves that were, as we might say, trumpeting away louder and louder? In any case, what Moses translated came from beyond anything we might call speech. When we blow the shofar, we seek to hint back toward that transferable reality. From our end of that dialogue with the one of inner silence, we too need to go beyond words. Translation. There is a one that is ever revealing itself to us within and behind the great diversity of life. That one is being itself, the constantly, endlessly changing evolutionary parade. Viewed from our end of the process, that search leads to discovery of that one as our human quest for knowledge and meaning, embracing both scientific advance and religious interpretation. But turned around, seen from the perspective of the constantly evolving life energy itself, evolution can be seen as the ongoing process of revelation or self-manifestation. We discover, it reveals, we discover. As the human mind advances from our point of view, understanding more of the structure, process, and history of the ever-evolving one, we are being given, from its point of view, ever greater insight into who we are, how we got here, and where we are going. But here is where it gets tricky. We are being given as a claim of revelation. The oneness of being, not a fellow in the sky with some sort of human will, nevertheless reveals itself to us. It speaks to us, not in human words, but in the language of instinct. Just as every tree in the forest is commanded by an inner voice that says, grow those roots, reach toward water, and stretch higher and get some of that sunlight. And every animal knows the inner voice that says, eat, thrive, mate and reproduce before you die. So does the human, because of the development of our brains, have an inner voice that asks, what are you doing here? Why have you come to be? Or in the imperative, figure it out. God said to the human, where are you? That single word ayeka is all I need of revelation. The rest is commentary. In it I hear the one cry out, make meaning, know me, be aware, remember. Act and live as one who is aware of the oneness of all being. It is all there in that divine charge or challenge. The ayeka turned around may also be read as another single word, anochi, I am. All that needs to be said is there in that pre-verbal anochi, the I am of Sinai, maybe even in its silent aleph. The deep truth of oneness is easily forgotten as we go on about the business of this worldly living. We have to surround ourselves with a series of reminders on our foreheads and on our doorposts, on our calendars, in our daily lives. The one calls upon us to create religions, even to create projected deities made in our image. We create gods because we intuit Yud He Vav He. We do so in response to our instinctive understanding, to hearing that inner voice. These days, especially as our world is so threatened, I tend to hear it in more plaintive tones, a plea rather than a booming command. Figure it out, humans, before it is too late. Can what you have just heard be termed religious naturalism? I have usually eschewed that term, mostly because it seems to be posed in opposition to something else called religious supernaturalism. I reject the distinction. I give credence to no supernatural event that is not fully natural. I also know of no natural event that cannot be seen as supernatural. If the inner eye is open, it's all a matter of perspective. I'm going to skip a paragraph for the sake of time. One final but crucial step. The fact that the oneness of being entered into this infinitesimal form that I call myself, and has chosen to linger here for these nearly 80 years, is not my doing. I did nothing to earn or deserve it. It was the entirely natural result of the act of love between my father and mother. But I also see it as yet another miraculously supernatural incarnation of the endless one. Consciousness, even the ability to contemplate the entire process of existence as we are doing here, entered into that fertilized ovum. I am grateful for it. I need someone to whom to express that gratitude. That is how I understand Mizmor LeTodah in one of my favorite psalms, a hymn to gratitude. A hymn to gratitude. I am grateful for this sense of gratitude, the beginning point of the religious mind. It forces me to sufficiently personify the one so that I have someone to whom I can say, thank you. Let me say this in another way. Because my existence is an unearned gift, I consider it an act of chesed, that which Christians call grace. The existence of all creatures, that which allows them to be, is seen by the mystic mind as the flow of shefa, divine bounty, or chiyut, the force of life, ever streaming from the one into each of the many. As divine radiance, taking the form of sunlight, flows into trees, they use it to make chlorophyll, their stuff of life. As that same radiance flows into us, we turn it into love, our stuff of life. The grateful religious mind experiences our existence as a matnat chesed, a gift of unbounding love. We feel called upon as receivers of love to love in return. We express that love in the way we relate to all other beings, loving them kamocha, as yourself, as part of that same single being. Next paragraph. This leads to what is most important to me, the possibility of a devotional life. That is what it's all about for us Hasidim and Neo-Hasidim, for us Heschelians and Neo-Heschelians. Yiddishkeit is a derech and avoda, as I heard Zalman Schachter say to me so many years ago. It made a big impression than Yiddish. Judaism is a way of service, or a path of devotion. To say that back in biblical language, Vatem tiyu li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh. You shall be unto me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. I stand in awe, and I stand in the awesome presence of the Cosmic One, and say to it, I am here to serve. I even feel called upon by the Cosmic One to serve in awe and in love. That's the payoff of my religious life. Explaining what I mean by it, as I have done here and elsewhere, is important. But that act of explanation, called theology, is a secondary act. It pales beside the moment of devotional response, of Avodat Hashem itself, which transcends all such explanations. Thank you, my friends. Thank you for listening. I apologize if I've taken a couple minutes longer than I should have, but happy to share this with you.
Oh, thank you. That was fascinating. We built a little bit of time cushion in, so Carrie, you don't have to rush. And then we'll get to questions and conversation after our third and final speaker this morning. So it's my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Dr. Carrie Hoffmeister-Tooling, who among other things has just published a book with JPS called Thinking About God, Jewish Views, appropriately enough. So we look forward to her talk now, titled Divergence or Convergence, Reading David Hartman in the Context of Mordechai Kaplan.
Hello to everyone. I think the first question I have to start with myself is, why am I here? And that answer, of course, is in the short term, my book, but also because what all of us are trying to do is think through what we mean by the term God and what we're trying to say when we invoke this term. I'm here now today to talk about Hartman in that context. And I want to start with this opening of a story when I was in rabbinical school. When I was in rabbinical school at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, what happened was one time we were in class, and I'm afraid I don't remember which class, so I'm sorry about that, or even which professor it was, but one of my fellow rabbinical students asked in response to the lecture, well, how does that relate to the work of Mordechai Kaplan? And the professor remarked in this sort of offhand way, well, we're all Kaplanists now. And he said it so matter-of-factly, in fact, that it seemed manifestly obvious, you know, like we're all Kaplanists now. And I mentioned this vignette in order to highlight what I consider to be Kaplan's greatest achievement, and that was he changed the terms of the debate. And so we do actually have these conversations in terms of supernaturalism and naturalism. This isn't taken as a self-evident point, but rather something that should be considered, as we saw in Art Green's presentation, which was such a beautiful statement of his theology at this point. So I wanted instead to think about David Hartman. Are we all really Kaplanists now? In his early work, A Living Covenant, The Innovative Spirit in Traditional Judaism, this is from 1985, David Hartman cited three thinkers who profoundly influenced his work, none of whom was Kaplan: Moses Maimonides, Joseph Soloveitchik, and Yeshayahu Leibowitz. That Hartman named Maimonides as an influence is none too surprising, because of course he does. If Judaism had patron saints, Maimonides would be the patron saint of Jewish rational discourse. We all claim him as our guide. The Israeli thinker Yeshayahu Leibowitz had been for Hartman a catalyst, a force for rethinking and re-examining, rather than a guide. It was Soloveitchik, rather, who cast the largest shadow. Hartman was a student of Soloveitchik, and he wrestled greatly with his teacher's thought. Ultimately, Hartman rejected much of it, yet elements remained with him, particularly his nostalgia for those intense spiritual environment of his youth. So to begin to answer the question of Hartman's relationship to Kaplan's thought, to try to answer whether it was a case of convergence or divergence, I'd like to start with Hartman's relationship to Soloveitchik. And I think this will also help us sort of think about what we've heard from Art Green just now as well, because this has to do with the issue of commandedness and of what is the role of the halakha of Jewish law in Jewish life, and what do we do with that sense of commandedness? Is there a set of normative demands that are made of us, or is this something that we're expected to respond to in a more existential way? So in A Living Covenant, Hartman relayed an example given by Soloveitchik regarding heroism, quote, "Whereas classical heroism is demonstrated only by stage heroes, the halakha enables heroism to be a genuine experience for Orthodox Jews in their ordinary everyday life. Soloveitchik's example is the woman who discovers on her wedding night that she has begun to menstruate, with the result that the bride and bridegroom are obliged by the halakha heroically to postpone the sexual consummation of their marriage. Just as in halachic man, the Talmudic learning allows every Jew to become a creator of worlds, so too in catharsis, the halakha turns every Jew into an unsung hero." End of quote. For Soloveitchik, part of the heroism of following the halakha has to do with the need to submit to the divine will. And one's own needs are nothing in the face of the great and awesome God. If the halakha demanded of you that you put aside your happiness, then you put aside your happiness. In this particular example, the sacrifice in question is merely a deferment of marital joys. There are other more demanding examples that could be imagined. There are categories of suffering created in the context of the halakha that may never be overcome so long as one is part of the halakhic system, the status of the mamzer, the bastard, for example. Hartman was aware of this problem, conceding that, quote, "all of Soloveitchik's examples of the cathartic dialectic experience are problematic," end quote. Note the use of the word all here. All of them are problematic. As Hartman pointed out, quote, "whether Soloveitchik speaks of catharsis, heroism, redemptiveness, or in-depth existential living, the bottom line is that Jews have a right to think, to feel, and to love, only to the degree that they are prepared to submit totally to whatever God will demand of them," end quote. Hartman clearly disagreed with Soloveitchik on this point, as Hartman retorts, quote, "the surrender of human rationality and the sacrifice of one's human ethical sense are not required by the Judaic faith," end quote. Nonetheless, Hartman retained that sense that the halakha made specific demands that should be heeded by all who consider themselves serious about Judaism. Along these lines, in Conflicting Visions, Spiritual Possibilities of Modern Israel from 1990, Hartman included an essay specifically addressing and critiquing Kaplan's thought. Hartman objected to the idea that Judaism was defined by the collective actions of the Jewish people. Quote, "Kaplan's God and his halakha mirror the given reality of the practitioner. His religious man is totally immersed in the 20th century and in fact with the immediate context of here and now," end quote. To the contrary, in Hartman's view, quote, "Judaism is not simply an instrument serving to perpetuate the Jewish people, but is a normative framework. Torah contains standards and indicate how the Jewish people ought to live. And it is not simply the cultural product of how Jews in fact live." So notice this insistence that there's some sort of outside, out there, other that makes the judgment as to whether or not you are doing it correctly. And in that you see the influence of Soloveitchik. That is to say, the halakha requires that certain sacrifices be made. As Hartman continued, quote, "Kaplan's religious attitude to life ignores the tragic, the absurd, and the incomprehensible. His religious humanism does not allow for experiences of surrender and submission to claims beyond oneself," end quote. At some point in Hartman's view, you will be asked to make some kind of sacrifice to be in full compliance with the halakha. Like the bridegroom and his bride, you'll have to defer some joy to be observant. But a gap emerged between Hartman's wholehearted embrace of halakha and his growing awareness that there were people who suffer under the system. In A Heart of Many Rooms from 1999, Hartman acknowledged this divided heart. Quote, and this is a long quote, "On one level, I embrace modern culture. On another level, I am often critical and repelled by it. I relate to modernity with both openness and reservation. Both moves define my soul. I'm very deeply rooted in the classical Talmudic tradition, which was perpetuated in the modern world by the Shiva, the Talmudic Academy, Torah culture. I thus can be a kindred spirit with the Orthodox Haredi community in Jerusalem, the Black Hat community who have chosen the culture of the shtetl over modernity. At times, I can truly say that I share their love of and devotion to Torah, their music, their spiritual yearnings. Yet, at other times, I can join the ranks of the Zionist rebels who have rejected traditional Judaism. My soul moves in multiple and diverse directions. End of quote. In that same work, Hartman articulated what he thought would constitute a valid basis for making a critique of the tradition. As he wrote, quote, "A traditional Jew earns the right to speak by listening. Learning is a condition for being taken seriously as a discussant in this tradition. If you don't study or listen with reverence, if you don't feel the burden of the tradition or speak with trepidation about your certainties, you will never gain credibility." End of quote. The difficulty here, of course, is one of access. Not all Jews within the tradition are heard, even if they study and listen with reverence. In particular, I'm thinking of the feminist critique of the tradition. Women are not invited to the table in a meaningful way in the traditional environment in which he was raised. In The God Who Hates Lies from 2014, Hartman acknowledged this omission, having engaged in extended conversations with his daughter Tova. As he wrote there, "Eventually, I came to understand that Tova was not merely fighting for women's rights, but for an honest, authentic Judaism. She helped me see that the issue is not fundamentally about women's rights, but about the type of God I worship. Could I worship a God who considered half the Jewish community to be not fully human and responsible? She showed me finally the ways in which my male-dominated religion was shot through with deep immoralities." That's quite the phrase, shot through with deep immoralities. I could no longer hide within the 4 cubits of halakha, no matter how comfortable, energizing, and inspiring that life might often be. End of quote. And that's an astonishing statement if you think about it. In strong language, Hartman criticized the tradition for its treatment of women. And as a Jewish feminist myself, I particularly appreciate his comments here. Reading his earlier works, I'm often writing long scribbled arguments in the margins, arguments that largely amount to "the tradition works for you because you are a beneficiary," but it presents genuine difficulties for people like me. It's also important to note here that this position is an explicit rejection of Soloveitchik's claims that we mentioned earlier. As you will recall, the bridegroom and his bride were expected to make sacrifices on their wedding night if she discovered that she had started menstruating. And that's a small sacrifice, but it is emblematic of the larger sacrifices that Soloveitchik would request of all Jews. In The God Who Hates Lies, Hartman also relayed the story of Peter, the descendant of the priestly line, who after years of searching at last found a delightful woman to marry, and Susan, his beloved fiancée, a convert to Judaism. According to the halakha, Peter should not marry Susan because she may have been promiscuous in her prior non-Jewish life, and he was required to maintain a higher level of purity as a descendant of priests. When Peter learned from his friends that he should not marry Susan, he was despondent. And Hartman made the decision, contrary to the halakha, to officiate at Peter and Susan's wedding nonetheless. Hartman did so, knowing it was contrary to the teachings of Soloveitchik, as Hartman explained, quote, "Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, my beloved teacher and mentor, would have disagreed in the strongest possible terms with my decision to marry Peter and Susan. He would have not seen it as a joyous occasion, but one of mourning for the loss of something far greater than the love of 2 people. I can say this confidently because he once described in a lecture his response when a parallel case had come before him. Soloveitchik expressed keen sympathy with the tragic, bitter irony of this couple's dilemma. Nevertheless, with no hesitation, he told her she must leave and he could not marry them." So, end of quote. Soloveitchik was willing to accept the idea that some will suffer under the halakha, and that such suffering was a necessary thing to protect its integrity. If the system itself is perfect, then those who are harmed by it must necessarily be harmed. There is no other way. In contrast to this position, Hartman stated his objections directly. Quote, "I cannot be bound or insist that others be bound by halakhic theology that privileges certain kinds of sperm, wombs, and genes and stigmatizes others, when everything I understand about the root of Judaism points to its essence as a spiritual system grounded in behavioral norms and theological insights open equally to everyone. I did not believe then, nor do I now, that, quote, chosenness, unquote, is the result of ontological uniqueness, end of quote. So we see here that Hartman rejected Soloveitchik explicitly, and that further, Hartman did not consider chosenness to designate any kind of ontological uniqueness. So does that mean that we're all Kaplanists now? In The God Who Hates Lies, Hartman acknowledged that he had to wrestle with Kaplan's thought. Quote, when the edifice of my yeshiva worldview began to crack and shift, what emerged was a personal quest for a frame of reference that would enable me to remain within the tradition, yet at the same time recognize its inadequacies and incompleteness. Embracing this intellectual path, encountering so many significant individuals with so much to say about the meaning of life and what elements enter into the creation of an identity, it altered my perspective on the Torah that I love so much. Suddenly, new issues began to surface. My Judaism had to face the criticism of Mordecai Kaplan and William James, of contemporary thinkers like Pierre Berger and Charles Taylor. My Beit Midrash had new students and new teachers. I could no longer hide behind the coattails of my erstwhile rabbis and Rosh Hashivas, who insisted that the received system was perfect, and any introduction of alien thought misplaced or dangerous, taboo, end of quote. In answer to our question, then, Hartman did not wholeheartedly embrace Kaplan, did not, but Kaplan's thoughts does show up in places. As we saw in his earlier works, Hartman had objected to the idea that halakha could be conceived of as an aspect of Jewish civilization. There was this sense that it was the only right answer to what it meant to be a Jew. However, in The God Who Hates Lies, Hartman revised this view to argue for a more pluralist approach to the halakha. Quote, it is extremely important that we place a space or create a space within our theology and within our communities for the legitimate, though not exclusive, positive understanding of halakha as a selective educational system, and not only as a legal system. For modern Jews who seek access to the lived experience of the Jewish community, it is not merely a tactical mistake to present halakha in terms of principles of authority, obligations, and the sinful consequences of failure to uphold all of the mitzvot. Well, it is a failure of the religious imagination and ultimately a failure of the Jewish community. The legalistic weight of halakha should be lifted completely without theological compunction. To be sure, asserting that halakha can be framed legitimately as an educational system is not necessarily synonymous with giving up on it as a disciplined system of authoritative laws. Halakha can function differently for different types of individuals and communities, meeting people at varying stages of their interest, experience, passion, and commitment. You hear there this idea that Judaism actually really takes all kinds, which is definitely a Kaplanian idea. Hartman also embraced the idea that vitality of Judaism lies in a sense of community rather than the authority of the halachic system. And here he actually explicitly calls out Heschel and says, I think that the community matters more. Quote, to become enchanted by the story of the community, by its historical drama, by the spiritual experience of togetherness, this is what mediates religious vitality in Judaism, end of quote. On the other hand, Hartman's mature theology continued to include the idea of Torah mi-Sinai, the idea that Moses received Torah from God at Mount Sinai. One gets a sense in this next passage that Hartman is not speaking metaphorically when he references the event at Sinai. Quote, I developed a theology based on the concept of covenant that understands the relationship between God and the Jewish people as one of intimacy and partnership. This covenantal model, in which God not only tolerates but demands and delights in Jews taking of responsibility for ever increasing dimensions of our individual and collective lives, infusing every element of human endeavor and experience with religious meaning and purpose, that describes the religious anthropology, characterized not by slavishness and a howling sense of inadequacy in the face of an infinite commanding God. Instead, it resurrects the vital and precocious religious spirit of the Talmudic rabbis, who understood that the implementation of God's will amid the complex considerations of human society and psyche requires, at times, the full and fearless assertion of our intellectual independence. And with this covenantal theology, the Zionist enterprise could be understood not as a rebellion against the tradition, but as an exciting new stage of covenantal responsibility. Not only was the Torah no longer in heaven, as the Talmudic rabbis declared, having been given over to human hands at Sinai, So too, the covenantal understanding of Israel's rebirth taught us that the direction of history was now included within the scope of human responsibility. So that's the end of the quote. So was Hartman a Kaplanist? No, not really. In my mind, a Kaplanist would have felt the need to contextualize and rationalize the idea of Torah Misinai in that last quote. Nonetheless, I don't think that I've ventured too far to say that the arc of Hartman's thought moves closer to Kaplan's thought over the course of time. From the outset, Hartman shared with Kaplan a deep commitment to the project of Zionism, but he strongly objected to aspects of Kaplan's thought. As Hartman broke from his yeshiva background, he came to appreciate Kaplan's commitment to pluralism, his emphasis on community, and his openness to reinterpreting Judaism in the light of changed circumstances. And that was the end of my prepared paper, and so I look very much to answering questions.
Yishar kochech, thank you, that's wonderful. You also introduced a term in Kaplan world where we usually say Kaplanian. I like
Kaplanian, okay.
No, I like Kaplanists, so thank you. So I want to start with a question from, I don't know whether it's from Carol Stern or Miriam Eisenstein, or both of them. This is primarily for Ari in response to his talk. Is there any difference in your view between Buber's concept of God and Heschel's? Ari, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, that's an excellent question. I would say there are deep differences between Heschel and Buber. I would actually preface it also by saying that just as Heschel conducted this dialogue, and debate with Kaplan, another of his important interlocutors was certainly Buber. I think, firstly, obviously, in terms of halacha and in terms of revelation, Heschel had a much more commitment to halachic authority, and he saw it much more important than for Buber. I would also argue, I'm not sure that Heschel's God is dialogical.
Yeah.
I think Heschel's God is much more theocentric. For Heschel, human beings have to undergo a certain process of self-transcendence, of humility, of contraction of the ego. And it doesn't come about through dialogue with God, but it comes about in a certain sense of shifting their intention, that God becomes the focus of their attention. And I think that's, one could even say, an anti-dialogical step, and I think it's directed against Buber. So in that sense, and I think there are other ways that Heschel and Buber differ, but in terms of their conception of God, I think they have very, very different conceptions of God.
Thank you. A question for Art Green, a simple one. How do you handle the problem of evil? If all is one and the one is good, whence evil? At least a short version.
Yes, you have a couple of hours for me. I want to jump in first to the
It's important questions.
I want to jump in first to the prior question about Heschel. I think the imperative quality of the divine voice is very important for Heschel. We need a God who makes demands on us. And in Buber, everything is about the reality of the dialogue, the fact of the dialogue, rather than the content of what God calls upon us to do. And that's what lies behind the difference in halacha, but it's a different notion of God. Heschel wants a human being to be able to respond to the divine imperative. And the post-Shoah setting for Heschel was very important that way. He needed a God who cared. For Heschel and his dear friend Elie Wiesel, the great sin of the 20th century was indifference, moral indifference. And an abstract God would be an indifferent God. And Heschel couldn't abide the notion of divine indifference. And divine indifference, the God who is not indifferent, also is the one who calls upon us to act and demands things of us. And that's very central to Heschel. I cannot resolve the problem of evil for you here and now. since I am a monist, I believe that everything comes from the same source, which says evil as well as good. Mi pi elyon lo tetzeh haraot v'hatov, question mark in the language of Kohelet. Don't both good and evil come out of the same place? Let me distinguish between two different things. One is evil, moral evil, which means to me malicious, willful torture of other human beings, killing of other human beings, inflicting of suffering by humans. And I distinguish that from the indifference of nature. I don't believe that cancer is evil. I don't believe that tsunamis are evil. They are the fact that nature takes its course and is indifferent to us, and we have to live with that reality. That's the way it is. The question to me, the real problem of evil is, what is it in the human being that brings us to that kind of evil? Because I have to believe there is a divine spark in every human being. So all I can say is something like the Kotzker Rebbe said: God is everywhere, but you can put your hand in front of your face and block it out. We have klipot in ourselves. We have klipot that we build up mostly as defenses in our childhood against realities or fantasies that frighten us. And out of that fright, the defenses created by that fright, we build up hatreds. And that hatred leads us to evil. Yes, God is present in that act as well as God is present in every act. I do not simply say, you did not hear me say that God is one and all good. I did not say all good. And I think we have to be part of that one, recognize that one, and turn that one toward goodness as most we can. Moral judgment is human. And taking our ability to lead the course of the one and where it goes is our moral choice. And I can give you footnotes in the mystical sources that say that God's own self is struggling against evil, and we have to participate. God has never overcome God's inability to handle evil, and we have to line up on the right side of that battle. And I think that some modernized version of where that is essentially where I stand.
Great. Thank you. Another question for Ari. What evidence can you present to indicate that self-realization is a legitimate concept psychologically or theologically?
I could answer for Kaplan. I think at the center of Kaplan's thought is the idea that human beings firstly have this innate need that they're always striving to expand, to get at certain actualization, fulfillment, and that really gives their lives meaning and purpose. Kaplan would also, I think, add that often we look at self-actualization and ethical strivings in binary forms, that self-actualization is egotistical. But he actually thought that collective goals and humanitarian goals and individual self-actualization are mutually fructifying. Now, it's part of our self-actualization is actualizing our moral strivings, our ethical strivings, our social needs. And therefore, he thought to better the world, it should be done through individual self-fulfillment. That if we all try to actualize ourselves, then Jewish nationalism would strive, Zionism would strive, and humanity would strive. So therefore, he thought this is a goal that it won't just make individuals more happy and better and growing, but it's essential for humanity as a whole.
Thanks. I'm going to stick with you. That question, by the way, came from Howard Leibson. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. So our colleague Mel Skult asks Ari, and this you sort of alluded to this in your presentation. In light of your presentation of Kaplan as naturalistic and pragmatic, how do you account for his frequent references to the presence of God?
I think he sees that as pragmatic. In other words, the belief in God allows us to set out on this path of self-actualization and human betterment. In other words, the idea of God as creator is actually, at the heart of it, is this idea that the world is lacking and that we as human beings, and as God's agent to try to better the world. And he thinks that there is reality supports our strivings. He thinks the world is built in a way that we can accomplish this. Our path. We can advance in our path towards self-actualization and world betterment, and that's the idea of God. That's the divine dimension, the sacred dimension of reality. But that's certainly not a transcendent supreme being. That's something that's immanent within nature, and calling it God for Heschel has some kind of pragmatic cash value, and that's why he continues to use that kind of language.
Thank you.
Not that I think I've convinced you, Mel. I assure you.
And I'm sure, I hope for a long time, including perhaps this afternoon. Speaking of which, Elizabeth Kaplan has posed a wondering/question in the chat to everyone about Kaplan and Abraham. That is our patriarch. And I think that's best deferred, particularly if Elizabeth will be joining us this afternoon, to Mel Skult's presentation. Yes, Art, you want to ask a question?
Yes, I wanted to turn to Carrie. Thanks for your paper. I wanted to ask you something about Hartman and Heschel.
Yes.
Toward the end of his life, Hartman took Heschel very seriously, and I heard him say that he had made something of a turn from Soloveitchik toward Heschel in his thinking in his last years. I wonder if you could comment on that.
Yes, I think that he really liked Heschel's, or really felt resonance with Heschel's idea of this experience of God in a direct way. And when you were talking about this sort of knowing God, he puts it in terms of lovers' terms of knowing God the way Adam knew Eve. And that I see as being a distinctly Heschelian kind of concept. And so in that regard, yeah, he really did move much closer to Heschel, but he kept the part that isn't Heschel is he says explicitly in The God Who Hates Lies, Heschel's emphasis on the individual in terms of God, it doesn't work for him. He thinks it needs to be more community-based, and he's actually more convinced that the entire community is going to matter. And in that sense, that's the place where I see Kaplan's influence in the idea of Judaism as a civilization. He's thinking that his experience of living in Israel and of seeing secularists who are willing to die on behalf of the state, he feels like Heschel's vision doesn't include that. And I think it's actually a good point. You know, when he raises it, I'm like, I had never thought about that, but you're right. Heschel never really accounts for secular experience in Israel, for example. But yes,
I would add, I don't think Heschel dealt with secular Jews at all. I think he saw, as Judaism is about connecting with spiritual dimension and reality, and ultimately experiencing this transcendent God. And secular Jew is not part of Heschel's vocabulary.
No, it really wasn't. And the idea that you wouldn't observe completely. We have several of these individuals who don't understand why people reject aspects of the halakha and why they might not find that it works for them. They think of it either intellectually, they must not accept it, or they might think that they want to assimilate, or they think that they find it inconvenient, and it doesn't occur to them that maybe it doesn't speak to these folks in any real way. Does that make sense?
I don't think Heschel was so much involved with the question of halakha as he was with mitzvah. For Soloveitchik, the issue was halakha. It's isha halakha, and it's the halakhic process that's sacred. Heschel was a halachically observant Jew, but he saw the inadequacy of halakha. He understood that halakha had somehow become frozen. I remember hearing him ask one day in a moment of frustration, how many rabbinic responses are there on whether you can open a refrigerator on Shabbos, and how many about whether you can fight in a nuclear war? That kind of thing. Heschel's frustration with halakha as it had come to exist. But Heschel, I think, was deeply ambivalent about Zionism. His book, Israel, an Echo of Eternity, was a kind of act of tshuva in some ways after 67 about his own tepid feeling towards Zionism. Even though he was a Holocaust survivor, lived in that Holocaust survivor generation. Somebody pointed out to me, I had never quite understood this until I saw it recently, Heschel's book, The Sabbath, which was so very popular, written in the 1950s, is a book about Judaism as rejecting space and sanctifying time in an era when precisely the Jewish people was returning to space and declaring the victory of space. And Heschel wants to say something different. And I think that remains significant to Heschel, even though he was a supporter of Israel, and he was a Zionist in the end, but in some ways, in practical ways, not really in spiritual ways.
Ari, did you want to say something?
No, I would just add, Art, that if you look at his book on Israel, it deals mainly with time and very little with space.
Yeah.
It's very strange. It's a defense of Zionism, and it's also as well as a defense of the centrality of temporality rather than spatiality.
Yeah, our friend has written about this.
Yeah. I think that's Hartman's critique of Heschel, is this, the community matters, the space matters, the people need a place to be. You can talk about time, but what about the space?
So thank you. Shlomit Finkelstein asks Carrie to speak a little bit about the, I'm going to paraphrase slightly, the built-in tension between the self, that is the individual on the one hand, and the community on the other as the most basic unit. Can this difference, or is this difference discussed by Hartman? Can this difference be discussed in looking at Hartman, I guess?
I think that Hartman, at least in his last work, really emphasized the community over self, not to say that he didn't have a deeply personal spirituality and that spirituality didn't matter to him a lot. But I think that some of that critique that you see in his book is the awareness that you have to think in terms of what the community needs and what all of the community needs. And so the fact, in my reading of him, is that he, if anything, felt guilty that he'd kind of retreated into this sort of self-enjoyable observance of the halakha and of this and enjoyment of the tradition, without recognizing that he was privileged and that people like his daughter couldn't access this tradition in the same way. And so that's why he ended up pushing towards community awareness in his later work. So I think it is a real tension, and I think that he comes down on the side of community by the time he finishes that book.
Yeah, and I think that's the Kaplan. I'm biased.
The Kaplan in him, yeah.
I recall, I wasn't there, but reading newspaper accounts of his funeral, his daughter Tova Hartman, in her eulogy, mentioned both Kaplan and Heschel as very important to her father at the very end of his life. Erica Guerra asks, based on something Rabbi Tuling just said earlier, but open to all, she says, all the speakers, your talk, and this is to Carrie, implies that the question of God, your talk deals with the ways that tradition and halakha are not always accessible or open to all seekers, at least in the same way, which seem to leave him, which I think is Hartman, bereft in some ways. This makes me wonder about joy. Is the wrestling with the challenges of tradition in the world how one finds a path to joy in one's faith path? Or is that wrestling, challenging as it is, a face of joy?
It's a very interesting
question. And then any Ari or
and hello, I know Erica, so hello. He had found a lot of joy in that observance, and the heroism that in the Soloveitchik kind of point of view, the heroism is your source of joy, even if you have to postpone, say, your marital joy. But that whole concept of joy is actually more of Hasidic in the sense of being able to experience joy in the context of religious observance. It sounds there you see the Heschel influence, the idea that it should actually be this sort of joyous experience as opposed to the postponement of it. So I'm not sure if I'm getting to your question, but that's my reaction.
Ari or Art, do you have any reactions there?
I would just say I agree with that. I think Hartman realized that within the Jewish tradition, there's this tension between awe and fear on the one hand, and joy and happiness on the other hand, and he consciously came out for the importance, almost the exclusive importance for joy and happiness. And he was very suspect about the psychological implications of overemphasis on fear within religious experience.
Yeah.
So I think
that's especially the later, that's the later Hartman rebelling against his own earlier self.
Right.
In some ways, the choice for Heschel over Soloveitchik at a certain point has to do with Chassid Misnagid. Even though much is made of the fact that Soloveitchik had a Hasidic tutor in his youth, he was essentially a Misnagid. If you look at the centrality of sin and repentance in Soloveitchik's thought, and notice that it's almost completely absent from Heschel's thought. Heschel talks constantly about mitzvah and almost never about sin.
Mm-hmm.
And Soloveitchik there's a very strong sense of sinfulness and the need to repent. And that's Chassid Misnagid. And I think Hartman, ultimately coming from a Litvak background and a yeshiva background, ultimately decided that there was something healthier about the Heschelian approach over Soloveitchik's.
Agreed.
Art, I actually read Heschel differently. I think for Heschel doesn't use the word sin, but he has a fairly pessimistic view of human nature, especially within the modern era. He sees human beings have wrought destruction on the world, and modern society is corrupt and needs radical reform and tikkun. So in that sense, I think sin is implicit in a lot of what he writes about.
Yeah, I'm thinking in that regard, he writes that to give birth to a child is a miracle, to kill millions of them is but a skill.
Mm-hmm.
That's Heschel. And so, yeah, there is a deep pessimism there in that regard, yeah.
Well, he has lived through the 20th century. I mean, Heschel was a Holocaust survivor, and that was indelible for him. And certainly seeing his involvement with civil rights in the Vietnam War. Remember how crucial he was in both of those involvements in the 60s. They were all formative experience for him. But for the individual, I guess, the need for mitzvah, the need to be open to the mitzvah, to the divine imperative, is very important. Concern with one's sinfulness and overcoming one's sinfulness and atoning for one's sinfulness is something you almost never see him talking about.
Yeah.
So I'll just point everyone to the chat people are posting, and Rabbi Dr. Gordon Tucker, one of our speakers tomorrow morning, says, when Carl Stern asked Heschel about optimism, he said, quote, "I'm an optimist against my better judgment," close quotes. And Elizabeth Kaplan has posted, regarding joy, it reminds me of Levinas and the joy of being of service to others. We have time for a couple more, and I have a couple more questions now in the queue. First from Diana Heller for Art. Regarding your distinction between the evil of human torture of others and indifference of nature. Well, I heard you last night, so I know a little what you're going to say, but what about global warming, which is the result of human selfishness and indifference to science? Please ask about the blurring here of the human and the natural, and our responsibilities to each other in the future, and our obligations and demands of our political leaders, particularly in light of the wildfires.
Well, we have reached a point in the history of this planet where the fate of all species is now in the hands of one species. That's never happened before. It's never been the case before. The decisions we humans make will affect whether this species or that species of bird survives up in Washington State, or whether tigers survive in Asia or Africa. Everything is now in our hands. And that's a very frightening moment in the history of humanity and the history of the planet. And that's a result, obviously, of our evolving skills and our evolving control. And it is a terrifying moment. I like to think in my moments of optimism, optimism against my better judgment, if I may pick that up from Heschel, I like to think that it's not coincidence that the first species that has the ability to destroy all higher forms of life on this planet also has the conscience that may keep us from doing it. Those are both aspects of humanity. And the religion is about cultivating that conscience and cultivating that inner voice that tells us to stop. I just want to say quickly, I think the moment in which we're standing is such an interesting one, because in this pandemic, we have shown, I mean, there hasn't been universal participation, of course, far from it, but so many of us have been able to change our behavior drastically because we see the danger in front of us. How do we transfer that experience to the much greater danger in front of us, which is the danger of climate change and global warming? What can we do? How can we say to ourselves, all right, you learned not only to put on a mask and to keep 6 feet apart, but to cut back your airline travel and to cut back your carbon footprint and all kinds of tremendous changes. How do we marshal that energy? How do we marshal this experience to make us face and change our behavior in dealing with the much greater crises ahead? I'm becoming involved these days with a group called Green Faith, which is an interfaith religious movement for a concern with climate. And I think we all have to do it. I'm also involved with something called J-Tree, which is a Jewish tree planting effort. And I encourage all of you to be involved in that. And that's the best about us human beings, that we can become active in a cause like this.
One more question for Art from Robert Weintraub. If one is able to develop a true monist mindset and corresponding general practice, how capable would Heschel, Kaplan, or you say they are to behave accordingly in their daily human interactions without rules and regulations? I guess getting at the role of law of some kind in Jewish life.
I do not believe we should live without rules and regulations. I used to be, when I was in my 30s, I had sort of anarchist tendencies, but I really don't. When it comes to the whole world of mitzvot ben adam lechavero, that is to say the interpersonal, I believe that rules are needed, society needs them. I think halacha has much to contribute there and is very backward and behind the times in many important ways, including all aspects of its relationship to women and sexuality. I think their halakha almost has to begin from the beginning again. Thank goodness we don't have a creature like a 4th century Babylonian woman in our society, and we shouldn't treat women like they are 4th century living in 4th century Babylon, any more than we want Islam to treat heathens as though they lived in 7th century Arabia. So it's time to step back from that. But in the world of the interpersonal, yes, of course we need rules and regulations, and I think there's much negotiable there. In the world of Ben Adam LaMakom, that is to say, the devotional life, I think Judaism has a very rich set of forms. I think they have become overly frozen, and Jews have developed entirely too much obsession with the details of proper performance. In this new book of mine, Judaism for the World, which has just come out, I have an essay called How I Practice Judaism, where I talk about what it means to be an Agadic/Hasidic Jew, rather than to be essentially a halachic Jew. I'm quite traditional in my praxis, but as a matter of personal choice and personal style, not as a matter of legal obligation. When you tell me Jewish praxis is halacha, is a way of halicha, walking toward God, walking in the path, I'm all with you. As soon as you tell me it's law, and therefore I am to be punished, or I am not adequate because I violate the law, you have me leaving the conversation. But that's within the context of being, as I say, a rather surprisingly at this point observant Jew.
Thank you. I posted a link to that book in the chat.
Good, thank you.
So Ari or Carrie, as we get toward closing, and then Art too, but he spoke last. Any final remarks or other remarks that you'd like to make?
Not really.
What's that?
Not mandatory.
Yeah. No, I'm actually pleased to hear Art Green also introduce the idea of monistic panentheism, because in my own book, the one here, I'm going to hold up my book because, must promote book.
Your book's in the chat too, or
Yeah,
what?
so JPS will be happy with me. I have in fact shown you the book. But in that, actually, one of the things I wonder about is whether he qualifies as a cosmic or as panentheistic. So I appreciate that you answered the question, and I think I came down right. But it's been such a pleasure and such an honor.
I'll squeeze in one last question from another of our presenters, Howard Wetstein, who will be speaking tomorrow afternoon, directed primarily at least to Ari. You said that Heschel's God is not dialogical. Story, Mother Teresa was asked about all her hours, I think it's meant to be, of prayer. She said, I listen. Then she was asked, what do you hear? What does God say? Her answer, God listens also.
Mhm. I would just add, I think you're right. I think it's more complicated than I actually presented it in the limited time I had. I think initially the encounter with God is not dialogical, but it is dialogical in the sense that God responds to human beings and he seeks out human beings. So on one level, there is a certain kind of dialogue going on between human beings and God, but it's not dialogical in the Buber sense. There is a need to transcend oneself and thereby accept God's revelations, God's demands, and that's an essential part of the religious experience for Heschel. Okay?
Great. So with that, we're going to close. A couple important announcements. So we're going to take about an hour for lunch, dinner, or brunch, depending on your time zone.